Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Vovchansk, and in this one we start out in the direction of Kharkiv, where there are several developments as the Russians have captured the village of Lubovka, half of the village of Lukyantsy, the rest of Zelene fighting towards Neskushne. In the east they have managed to fight and enter Vovchansk, where they have managed to gain a foothold in the first streets and managed to push on to the central parts where the fighting is now taking place in the northern parts of the town. We see that heavy fighting takes place in that direction, and fighting is also expanding eastwards towards Zubine, here to the east of Vovchansky Khutory. So we see that the Russians are expanding their fighting along the Severodonetsk river line in the northern parts of Vovchansk and eastwards. In the western direction here by Lubovka, the Russians first started out by pushing outwards from Morodovets towards the Ukrainian positions by Lubovka, expanded further here by the forest patches south of Netailove, and then moved on to the Ukrainian fortifications to the east of the village. This allowed the Russians to then combine a push from the north to avoid the Ukrainian fortifications north of Lubovka and flank the Ukrainian positions both from the east and the west. This prompted a withdrawal for the Ukrainians from the village, and a head-on push towards the village allowed the Russians to then capture the village. This means that there is now no villages between the Russian positions and Lipsy, which is the regional powerhouse of the Ukrainian defenses and fortifications in the area. Other than Lipsy, there is Vesele to the east. These are the two frontline villages that the Ukrainians now have available in the area. Vesele and Lipsy is the next Ukrainian defensive line, going from Lipsy through Vesele and to the east towards Ternova. This is the Ukrainian front line right now. The Russians will push through towards Neskushne to capture that. This is a small village, but the Murom River is allowing the Ukrainians to hold that position. However, now that the Russians have captured the rest of Zelene, they're now able to push onwards as they are on both banks of the river line. So with this, we see that the Russians will push on towards Neskushne to capture that, and then fighting will reach Vesele from the east and to Lipsy from the west. This means a general push from the Russians down in a southern direction towards both of these villages and the fortifications in between them to push onwards towards the Ukrainian positions in Kharkiv. So this is the push directly towards the city of Kharkiv. An interesting / fun fact is, if we take a look at the general area of the Russian positions here in the area, directly south is a distance of about 7 kilometers to the edges of the front line. Taking a look in the south in the Zaporizhia front in the direction of Robotyne, we see that the village of Robotyne is approximately 7 kilometers from the front line started prior to the Ukrainian summer offensive. So what the Ukrainians achieved after many months of fighting, the Russians achieved here in the north by Kharkiv in just 3 days. And there's no arguments as to why the Russians should have an easier time doing this than the Ukrainians did, because the Russians had an equally long period of time, actually a shorter available time to build fortifications, yet they managed to build multiple lines of fortifications in the Surovikin line. The Ukrainians had even longer time. They have the same ability to place mines. They have the same ability to build fortifications. The Ukrainians not defending and losing this much territory in such a short period of time is entirely due to the failure of the Ukrainian command in this section of the front line. The Ukrainians are aware of that fact, and therefore the commander of the Kharkov region was fired, and instead he was replaced by Yuri Galushkin, who is a brigadier general. So we see that the Russians have pushed and broken through the initial Ukrainian defensive positions near the Kharkiv-Belgorod border, and this has led to many kilometers of Russian advances, pushing through an area larger than that of Robotyne within just a few days. And this has led to the Russians pushing a significant deal away from the front. This is still far from the city of Kharkiv, but we do see that the initial defensive positions and minefields have been cleared. What follows is going to be more difficult as time goes on, but that was similar case in the Ukrainian summer offensive. The longer they went south, the more difficult it would become, yet they failed at the start. The Russians have managed to do this and accomplish this, yet they have still not committed their main force. At the same time, there are reports that the Ukrainians are sending significant reinforcements to the area. This includes units of the 3rd Azov Brigade, units of the 79th Air Mobile Brigade, and 17th Tank Brigade, as well as several territorial defense brigades. This means that the Ukrainians are sending upwards of 10 to 20,000 soldiers as reinforcements to Kharkiv to send to the front line in the direction of Vovchansk, Lipsy and Vesele to stabilize the front and possibly counterattack against the Russian positions. This means that the Russians have one of two options. The first option is that they end this reconnaissance mission that they call it, simply the first strike into Ukrainian territory near Kharkiv, and that is very unlikely that this happens. Instead, what is more likely to happen is that the Russians commit to this. They send additional forces and go on to push against the Ukrainian positions in the area. Or they simply open another front further north in the direction of Sumy or Chernihiv, where they will push in a northern direction and expand their front line further. The Russians are seeing that the Ukrainian defensive positions here in the Kharkiv directions are not even close to as stable as the Ukrainian positions in the Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia portions of the front line, as well as eastern Kharkiv by the Oskar River line, which means that the Russians have much more potential to break through the Ukrainian lines in the north compared to in the east, and that would have a significant impact on the front line and the morale of the Ukrainian soldiers. We may see larger operations taking place due to the success that the Russians are seeing in this initial phase. In the direction of Vovchansk, the fighting is very intense here as well. We see that there is street fighting with Russian infantry fighting vehicles in the northern outskirts of Vovchansk. The Ukrainians are sending the majority of the reinforcements in this direction. Their goal is to hold on to Vovchansk at all costs. The capture of Vovchansk would allow the Russians to completely open up this section of the front line. It would allow the Russians to push through towards the highway here connecting the east and west here in the northern section of the Kharkiv front. It will also allow the Russians to start a push from the east to connect with that push from the west at the same time, and then push further south and start an operation near the Oskar River line. It will allow the Russians to encircle this northern part section of the Ukrainian Kharkiv region, and all of this will allow the Russians to then push on to these positions. So we're seeing that there is a significant importance and strategic significance to Vovchansk, which is why the Ukrainians are sending all of their reinforcements to hold it. However, heavy Russian bombardment of the town will inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainians. This means that the defense of the town will come at a high cost due to the Russian Air Force and artillery forces, missile forces, heavily bombarding the town day in and day out. Moving on to the eastern front, we see that here to the east of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have made a small advance by the railways in the direction of Chasiv Yar on the northern flank. As I said in my previous video, the Russians will likely push through in the northern flank towards the first patch here and the crossing across the canal in the northern flank of Chasiv Yar. At the same time, they'll likely continue to push in a southern direction along the canal line to gain control of the southern flank of Bakhmut and then fight over the micro-district of Chasiv Yar in the coming days. Further south here in the direction of the west of Semenivka, the Russians are expanding west of the village, both to the south and to the north of it. This is along the road where the Russians will going to be pushing in the direction of Novoselivka, Persha and Novopokrovsk, as they want to expand their positions and bridge it across the river line to then start further operations to gain full control over Umansk, push in the direction of Novopokrovsk and Novoselivka, Persha, and push on to the next Ukrainian defensive line. At the same time, to the south, the Russians have captured the central parts of Netailove, pushing the Ukrainians into the final parts in the west. This would mean that the fall of Netailove is closing in. The Russians will gain full control over the rest of the village and expand in a northern and southern direction. This will allow the Russians to flank the Ukrainian fortifications and positions west of Nevelske, push towards Yasnobrodivka and Umanskyt from the south, and towards the lakes here to the west of Netailove, strengthening the Ukrainian southern flank west of Avdiivka and concentrating their forces in the north towards next Ukrainian defensive line. Further south, here to the north of Volodymyrivka, east of Volodar, the Russians have made this small advance, pushing the Ukrainians back to the next defensive position, and some positional fighting is occurring in the area. This could signal that the Russians may be looking to do some positional fighting and increase their efforts here by Konstantinivka and Volodar to start further offensive operations in this section of the front line. There's been no developments in Staromayorsk and Urushaine, nor in the Robotyne section of the front line. With that, we see that the Russians continue their offensive operations across the front, making some positional fighting here and there, but the main push is coming in the direction of Kharkiv, Ocheretine, Chasev Yar, and Krasnoorivka. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon for additional content, where I recently uploaded a video where I talk about the morale of the Ukrainian and Russian civilians and soldiers throughout the war as a recap as to current situation and how it developed to what it is. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.